Hey guys, how's it going? I am here to do a sort of double video to talk about what I've been reading this week, and then to do the Read My Country tag, which I was tagged in by Unicorn over at the Bookish Land. So thanks for tagging me. But first, I'm going to talk about what I have been reading aside from ShakeTube, of course. But I said on my video on Monday that I was going to be reading Václav Havel and others' The Power of the Powerless, a collection of essays, and then Ivan Klima's novel Love and Garbage. And the day after that, I completely abandoned them in favor of reading this thing, which I haven't talked about at all on this channel. But it's Political Psychology, Key Readings. So it's a collection of 24 articles, classic articles in the history of the field of political psychology. Political psychology, probably the name is pretty self-explanatory. It's about what psychological factors go into the political climate, outcomes of political elections, people's political perspectives, and all that stuff. It's divided into several parts, ranging from personality, theories of personality, to the media's effect on elections, to the personalities of people in office, and how that affects politics. It goes everywhere, and this is the field I want to study, so I think this is a good reading to get under my belt. But the first part is about an old concept in political psychology called right-wing authoritarianism. Or that's what it's called now. It used to just be called authoritarianism, but it's gotten changed around a little. But it basically started out as from this idea that Theodor Adorno and Elsa Frankel-Brunswick, I think that's her name, at the Frankfurt School, had this idea that there was a certain personality of person that became very common in Nazi Germany that allowed for the rise of Hitler. These people all voted for Hitler, and it was all based on feelings of being threatened and wanting a good authority to kind of come along and take care of them from all the things they perceived as threatening their way of life or their safety or something. And there were other theories that Adorno and his colleagues had early on that were kind of out of favor because they're based on sort of these psychoanalytic theories. But the construct of right-wing authoritarianism has continued to be important in political psychology. It's gotten much more refined as just sort of a general or personality variable that predisposes someone to be very, very submissive to authority, and also very sort of aggressive towards anyone who they perceive threatens traditional values or authority and things like that. And that's the first part I've been reading about, and those are some good. Those are really good readings to have under my belt, because I think my master's thesis might relate somewhat to that. But the next section I'm going to be reading, actually I'm not quite done with the authoritarianism, the personality part of the book. But the next section is about mass media and candidate perception. That's another thing think is really interesting. I might try to study for my PhD, which is sort of this idea of how the entertainment we see and that we seek out affects our political views and affects the extent to which we see the injustices in society. So that should be very interesting. I'm liking this reading. I'm reading one article per day. There's 24 articles in it. I've read 3 so far. I think I read 3. No, I've read 4. Okay, so I have 20 more. So that should be done in 20 days, approximately. I might read another article today since it's Saturday and I have some time. But that is what I'm reading. I'm also, of course, reading Richard III, which I'm loving, by the way. But moving on now to the Read My Country tag. So, as I said, I was tagged by Unicorn over at the Bookish Land, whose video I will link in the description. So this tag just asks you a bunch of questions about books from the country you come from. And I was thinking of doing the Czech Republic, because I'm technically a dual citizen with the Czech Republic, so it's not, like, far-fetched of me to do it for this tag, but I haven't read nearly enough Czech literature for me to do any sort of justice to it. American literature, I'm still, as you will probably find out in the course of this video, kind of not as well read as I want to be, but I have certainly read much more books by Americans than books by Czech authors. So I'm talking. That's the first question. Just identifying which country you're talking about. The next question is, what's a famous children's book from your country, or what was your favorite children's book? I don't really have a. I did read some books as a kid, but they were all by. They were generally by British authors, actually. But a very famous children's book from the U.S. is Charlotte's Web, by E.B. White, which I did watch the movie of that a few times. It wasn't my absolute favorite as a kid. Not that I didn't like it, just I don't have many vivid memories of it. My brother loved it. My brother was a huge animal lover when he was young. I hated animals when I was young, even though I was the one who became a vegetarian later. Kind of weird, but anyway, that's beside the point. Yeah, it's about a little piglet who was the runt of his litter, and the farm the man who owns the farm that Wilbur, that's the name of the piglet, is born on, wants to slaughter him because he's so tiny, because he thinks he won't ever be valuable, but the farm owner's daughter saves Wilbur, and then it's just about Wilbur and his friendship with a spider named Charlotte. Next question is, what is a book from your country that you read in school? There are several books I could talk about, but I'm just going to talk about the ones that I happen to have here. One is The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway, which I loved. It's a story of a man named Santiago, who's kind of an aging fisherman living in the Caribbean somewhere, and he's old, and he's kind of made fun of because he never makes any big catches anymore. But this little boy in the town he's living in comes, and Santiago takes the boy under his wing, but eventually Santiago tells the boy, okay, I'm old, I'm near the end of my career, you need younger fishermen to help you learn this trade, and you also need to not be with me since I'm always made fun of, and so people might look down on you because they look down on me. So he tells the boy to go with the younger in relation to him, so these are men in like their 20s and 30s. The boy is like a 12 or something, and he sends the boy to go with them, and then Santiago decides to go on one last big fishing trip, and he ends up trying to catch this huge marlin, and it's just his struggle with catching this marlin, pursuing it, and then catching it, and then trying to bring it back to the town. And so it's sort of a story of sort of manliness and persevering, which might not sound like the most resonant themes, but it's so beautifully written that even if you don't care for those themes, I think you would love the novel anyway. And it's a novella, really. It's super short. The next one is The Catcher in the Rye, which I read in high school, and of course I liked it just as much as anyone else does. And that's all I'm going to say about it. And lastly, I read The Sirens of Titan, which I was 17 when I read it, and it was the first book to blow my mind. I still remember how I felt reading the last, 40 pages. I still remember. It was my first exposure to these deep existential themes about the meaning of life. So, yeah, and subsequently my excitement over the book has been worn away because I've read about those ideas in other books, and seen that Kurt Vonnegut didn't necessarily deal with them better than anyone else. It was just happened to be that this was my first exposure to it. So I did love this book, and I still like it. I reread it last year. So yeah. The next question is, what's a book set in your favorite area of the country, or in an area of the country that you want to visit? So I sort of have answers. I sort of have 3 answers-ish. My favorite areas of the country are upstate New York, where I grew up. Very hilly, very forested. I grew up underneath a big escarpment. An escarpment, for anyone who doesn't know, is kind of a wall of mountains. It's not like mountains, it doesn't have peaks, it's kind of one big thing of mountains. So it always kind of felt like I was growing up under this kind of protective shield, kind of like the wall in Game of Thrones, but not nearly as big, but yeah. So a book that does take place there, which I haven't read, which I might eventually, is The Last of the Mohegans by James Fenimore Cooper. That was also made into a really famous movie that I love. I'm a sucker for historical dramas in terms of movies. So it's about a white man who was raised among the Mohegans, who were a dying tribe of Native Americans during the French and Indian War, so in the 1700s. And just about him in the French and Indian War. I don't remember many of the plot points, but follows him and his romance with a British woman, and there are some Native Americans who are fighting with the French that they are being pursued by, and yeah, it's just sort of a historical drama. The next book is in an area of the country that I want to visit, and which I sort of have visited, but not this particular place. The second place in the U.S. that I really love is the West. So that area of the country from Montana down through Wyoming, or down through like Utah and Arizona. But a part of that is Idaho. And one novel that takes place in Idaho is Marilynne Robinson's Housekeeping. So this takes place in a tiny town, Fingerbone, Idaho, and it's just about two sisters, Ruth and Lucille, and their mother commits suicide when they're young, and they are taken care of primarily by their aunt, their mother's sister, and it's just about these two young girls searching for their identities in adulthood, and it's beautifully written. I don't want to say it's better than the Gilead trilogy, but it's hard for me to rank any of Marilynne Robinson's novels. But yeah, Idaho is a place I really want to visit, just because it's a part of that area of the country. I want to visit all the places in that area of the country. I want to visit Montana. I want to go to Glacier National Park. I want to visit more of Wyoming, like Yellowstone and Grand Teton, and I want to visit the Black Hills, Arizona, maybe the Grand Canyon someday. But yeah, this is going to be my stand-in for that entire area of the country. And then the last place in the U.S. that I'm starting to really like is Iowa. And I don't really know why, but there's something very, I find very calming about the landscape in Iowa. I feel like it's a bit more forested than Illinois is, at least, and certainly more forested than further out west. So that might be why because it reminds me of where I grew up, but it still is flatter and is still in the Midwest. I don't know, but a novel that takes place there, you might see this coming from a mile away, is another Marilynne Robinson novel, Gilead, which has been talked about enough that I don't feel like I need to introduce it, but it's a story of John Ames, who's in his 70s and he's dying, and he has a very young son, a 7-year-old son, who he wants to be able to know him in some way, so he writes this sort of fictional memoir for his son to read so that he can know him after he dies. And it's very, very, it's beautifully written, just like Housekeeping, Next, what the historical fiction book set in your country? Well, Last of the Mohegans would qualify as that, but another book that I actually, I'm a bit more eager to read than that one is Days Without End by Sebastian Barry. Now, this feels like a bit of a weird book to include since it's not by an American author, but it does take place during the Civil War in the United States and during the Indian Wars. It's sort of a love story between two men at that time. And I really love stories like that put the same-sex love stories that happened in contexts that we don't normally think of. Kind of like Brokeback Mountain, which the story of which I haven't read, but I love the movie. That's actually my favorite performance by Heath Ledger, even more than the Joker. So I want to read that at some point. Yeah. What is a book by an indigenous author? And if you'll indulge me, this is an area that I've been getting more into this year, and I want to read more of next year. But I am actually gonna break this tag a little bit and do 3 books, all of the different genre, sort of. So first we have The Way to Rainy Mountain by N. Scott Momaday. So N. Scott Momaday is a Kiowa from the Kiowa Nation. This is a book of this is sort of a compendium of the myths of the Kiowa, but they're interspersed with the history, like the history that we know of the Kiowa, and with certain events from Momaday's own life. And he sort of weaves these three themes in the myth, the history, and then his own life, and really gives you a look at the importance of myth in Kiowa life and in his own life. So kind of a look at just the way I wanted to describe it was like a look at the way a Kiowa person might see the world in a way, which I think is so important. Seeing how these oppressed peoples like the Kiowa see themselves rather than how white people see them. So I think this is a very important book. I recommend that everyone read it. Another book that I recommend everyone read is a memoir. This is Lakota Woman by Mary Crow Dog. So this is her memoir of, well, just her life in general, but she was one of the primary leaders of the American Indian movement, which in the 60s and 70s, at the same time when the Black Civil Rights Movement was also active, began to call for more rights for Native Americans, because a lot of reservations had these sort of semi-dictatorial or completely dictatorial leaders. Native Americans were poor, and they were just looking for the United States to, help them out more than they were. And so there are two kind of culminating events in this memoir. One is the occupation of the building in Washington, D.C., where the Bureau of Indian Affairs is housed, and then there's the occupation of the site of the massacre of Wounded Knee. And I just think it's so important because this is a subject area where I knew nothing, and I don't think I would be willing to bet money that almost no Americans know anything about this period in our history. We learn a lot about Native Americans in the 1800s, and then basically you would think after Wounded Knee that they just kind of fell off the side of the world. But they obviously didn't. So, yeah, I think this is a good introduction to that area of history. And then the last one is just an anthology of Native American poetry, if you're into poetry. This has many, many authors. It was hit or miss for me. And Scott Momaday is actually in here. He was one of the ones I liked, and he also wrote a novel called House Made of Dawn, which was the first novel by a Native American to win the Pulitzer Prize. But anyway, this anthology, it's from the 80s, and it has a lot of authors who were prominent during the Native American Renaissance. So in the late 20th century, there was a big blossoming of Native American fiction and poetry and playwriting. It's kind of a blossoming of Native American culture in general. So if you're interested at all in poetry, I do recommend this. It was hit or miss for me, like I said, but that's to be expected of any anthology full of an entire kind of group of people's poetry. Just like my anthology of Chinese poetry was kind of hit or miss. But definitely some poems that I loved in there. And next is a classic book from your country, and you might see this coming from a mile away too, and it's Moby Dick by Herman Melville. This blew me away when I first read it. It's gorgeously written. The ending totally knocked me out. And the middle parts, you might argue, are kind of boring, but I actually feel like there are some really exciting parts of the middle parts of it. So the middle parts of Moby Dick are kind of notorious for just being full of information dumps about whaling and whales and the way ships work and all that good stuff. And therefore being very boring. But, I don't know, I felt like I learned some cool things there. And Curtis, from Curtis Books and Films, commented at one point that he actually found those anecdotes about the information dumps kind of funny. So, that definitely tells me I need to reread it, because I don't remember finding them very funny. But, yeah, so I might reread this next year. Don't hold me to that, though. Next question is a book that you haven't read but would like to read. And there are many. Faulkner is a big one that I haven't read any of that I want to. But one that I actually do have with me is Death Comes for the Archbishop by Willa Cather. This was recommended to me by Fariba at the Medieval Reader, who said that if I like Gilead, I might like it. And I looked up a brief synopsis, and it takes place in New Mexico, and I think it's about sort of settlers coming to New Mexico, and anyway, like I said, I'm interested in that area of the country too, New Mexico, the Southwest/West in general. So this is one I'll be getting to soon, hopefully. But then there are also a lot of authors who I've been itching to read who are in here. This anthology of American literature. So this starts from the earliest American literature and ends with Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman is one author I need to read more of, but others in particular that I want to read are like Emerson and Thoreau. Those two mostly, but I also think I'd like to read more of Melville's work. I've read, obviously, Moby Dick, and then I read Benito Cereno, and, oh gosh, what's the other one? Bartleby the Scrivener, that's the one. And then I also want to see if I can get through more Hawthorne. I want to reread The Scarlet Letter at some point, and maybe read a bit more of him. I don't know. I don't remember being a huge fan of The Scarlet Letter, but it was so long ago that I can't remember much. So yeah, The Scarlet Letter is in here, so I'll be getting to that at some point. But then I also love... my first love in poetry ever was Emily Dickinson, who's difficult, but when you do get something out of her, it's pretty great. And also the language is just beautiful. And then I also really like the poetry of T.S. Eliot, who, again, difficult, but when you get something out of him, it's pretty profound. And then, I mean, I would throw in Moby Dick here, too. I love Moby Dick. I love the Sirens of Titan, The Catcher in the Rye, and The Old Man in the Sea. I also love A Farewell to Arms by Ernest Hemingway, which is right here. Yeah. I guess those are my favorite authors. I don't know. I don't usually think of my favorite authors in terms of what country they're from, but there you have it. So that is the Read My Country tag. So, thank you guys. Bye.